So with that, I think that's about all I want to say. Almost all I want to say. I do want to say I'm really excited about tonight. This is the highest participation we've had in any of our talks. And it just, it's just a testament of the passionateness of sheep hunters and people that are interested in sheep. And this is kind of in the last couple of years, we've been doing a lot of work on outreach with sheep, and including like starting with the Dall Sheep News, and we put out the Full Curl ID guide. And we've also put out a lot of information lately about sheep disease research, which you're going to get a culminating presentation about that tonight. So I'm pretty excited about tonight, and I appreciate everybody showing up to this. And with that, I'm going to introduce Brad Wendling. He's the Region 3, which is interior and northeast Arctic Alaska. He is our sheep research biologist, and he's going to be kicking things off tonight and introducing our other participants. So Brad, with that, I think I'm just going to hand it over to you to share your screen.
Okay. Does it look good, Mike?
Yeah, you're good. Yep.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm going to repeat a couple things that Mike had said. It's really great to see the interest in this talk tonight, and people coming from Canada and folks, our fellow researchers out of BC and Canada. And yeah, anyway, it's great for the passionate sheep community to all come together in this winter night. So we're going to be talking about Alaska Dall sheep history and some of the current and ongoing research. The speaker tonight is going to be Dr. Tom Lohuis. He is a sheep research biologist / management coordinator based out of the Anchorage office. We're going to have a talk from Dr. Kimberlee Beckmen. She is our veterinarian, wildlife veterinarian based out of Fairbanks office. We have Joe Want, who is a former master guide who specialized in Dall sheep hunting and Kodiak brown bears for many years. But he also is a unique character, and he has a long history of like working with the department. Sometimes we pay him, sometimes he don't, but he's been helping me out ever since I got hired on this job. He's been really instrumental. And then again, myself, my name is Brad Wendling, and I am the sheep researcher based out of Fairbanks. And with that, I'm just going to kick this the talk off. And we're just going to kind of talk about sheep and a little bit of their life history to set the background. I don't really know. I think we may have a wide variety of, interest and knowledge about sheep. So let's just start at the very beginning. Start our presentation tonight. I thought we'd just, start off by talking what is a Dall sheep and talk about its general life history. So Dall sheep are the northernmost species of mountain sheep in North America. The severe Arctic and subarctic conditions have placed unique constraints on these mountain ungulates. They were named after the prominent naturalist W.H. Dall, which is why you will see the name written as a possessive adjective in many publications. It's really nothing to get hung up on unless you are writing for scientific publications. And so the answer to our question on the survey at the beginning is probably either neither or both. All right, so with that, these sheep are sexually dimorphic and having, weights is always changing as they're putting on weight in the summer and losing weight in the winter. But generally for an adult males, they'll get up to about 180 to 200 pounds, while the females are smaller and their fall weights would range more in the 120 pound range. There's extreme sexual dimorphism in the horns, with the females having shorter and slender horns. And the male horns, while smaller than their cousins' big horns, are a significant portion of their overall body weight and serves as their source of weaponry. Their hooves are adapted to walk on steep and precipitous terrain. They have excellent eyesight and a great sense of smell and a thick woolly fur to help insulate them in the winter. Now, the distribution of Dall sheep, they're found within the mountainous regions of Alaska, the Yukon territories and the Northwest territories, and the upper portions of British Columbia. And since this is an Alaska-centric talk, Our Alaska sheep populations are found spread out across 8 mountain ranges, starting at the north in the Brooks Range. We have small populations in the White Mountains and the Yukon-Tanana uplands. There's actually a little bit of overlap here in the Ogilvie Mountains where we do find a few sheep. There's larger populations within the Alaska Range and Wrangell St. Elias, the Talkeetna Mountains, and the Chugach Mountains, and small populations down on the Kenai. But, well, we're going to pick up at the rut. We're going to go through a year of the life history of sheep. So the rut takes place mid-November to mid-December, and these sheep have a kind of a dominance hierarchy based on a combination of age, body mass, and horn size. You know, the rut consists of courting, chasing, fighting, tending, and so the females, they can become sexually mature at about 18 months of age, but the reproduction, if they're really able to do it, is kind of related to both nutrition and overall body condition. So the estrus period is about 1 to 3 days, during a time which there'll be many copulations. Now the rut is incredibly energetically expensive for the males and sometimes non-receptive females if they're being chased and harassed as the rut progresses. Now, if the female conceives and they're in good enough body condition, they'll have a gestation period that lasts for about 171 days. So once the rut's over, they're into the winter habitat selection, the winter habitat use. Now, the winter range is kind of the limiting factor for sheep populations. Winter is kind of defined by the needs of finding available forage to slow the rate of weight loss, yet to be able to escape predators if needed. The sheep are kind of limited to foraging with areas of less than 30 centimeters of snow, and patterns of diet selection can be affected by as little as 10 to 15 centimeters of snow. They don't spend a lot of time digging or cratering, and therefore, like icing events can really prevent them from accessing their feed source. Therefore, they're dependent on these high winds and the long drainages that have predominant winds to blow these areas free of snow, so they can feed on, the diet's varied, but dried sedges and grasses. And there's even documentation of using lichens from time to time. It is a really tough time to be a sheep during this time of year. Once we get through the winter and coming out of winter, the onset of spring, we come into the lambing period. Now, generally, the lambing period is from mid-May to mid-June. Now, while there's some variability between years, the majority of the births are likely to happen between May 17 and May 24. When it is time to give birth, the females will leave their ewe group and seek isolation in a really rugged terrain for birthing. Sheep have singletons. Rarely is there documentation of twinning in sheep. So they have singletons, and when they're born, they're pretty small, ranging between about 3.2 kilograms to 4.1 kilograms. Now, these lambs are very, very precocious, and very soon after they're dropped, they gain their legs and are able to hop around on rocks. They will remain isolated from the main group for 1 to 2 days, with the ewe, frequently suckling her lamb before they rejoin their nursery groups. One thing I want to point out, so this lactation period for the ewes is energetically more expensive than the gestation period that they just came out of. So there's this balancing act between finding high quality forage and safety from multiple predators, including wolves, eagles, coyotes, bears. So this slide's a little messy, but I'll kind of go through it. The first month in the year of life is hard for a lamb, and as biologists, we often use lambs per 100 ewes as a measure of population productivity. These ratios can be highly variable from year to year based on predation and stochastic weather events like flooding, icing, and avalanches. A predecessor of mine, Steve Arthur, had a lamb mortality study in the Brooks Range in the late 2000s. And one of the 2 years, the primary source of deaths of the lambs were drowning events. Now, there were a couple of studies that had happened in the Alaska Range by Brad Scotton and Steve Arthur. And over the course of their studies, the main source of predation was coyotes. Now, for Steve's work, it was a 5-year study. Their survival of rams ranged between 15 and 63%. And this is kind of similar to what Tom Lohuis down in his lamb survival work in the Chugach found. About a third of the lambs are born survived. About a third of them died of some predatory event, including eagles, and about a third of them died in some sort of accident. So this top graph, and it's not the greatest one I could find, but it's just a generalized mortality curve. And so that first year of life is tough, and we can lose a lot of animals in. But once they reach 1.5, 2 years of age, things are pretty good until they reach about 8 years of age. Generally we find about 85% survival, year-to-year survival during this time period. But it's still susceptible, they're still susceptible to extreme weather events and periodic predation. And once we get through that, the summer consists of repeated feeding and ruminating bouts as they need to replenish their body reserves and put on enough fat to do it all over again. They are often sexually segregated at this time, ram groups and nursery groups. And they seek out forage that's in its early phenological stages when levels of crude protein and digestibility is high. And this is often referred to as, riding the green wave. So you'll see movements, altitudinal movements as green up goes up in elevation, the sheep will move up the mountain. And they'll also make movements in regards to aspect. Green up happens on the south and west aspects first, and later on the east and north aspects. So there's still this trade-off between forage quality and distance to escape terrain. And with that, we move into the fall hunting. And this is where I'm going to kind of turn the talk over to Joe. These sheep are approaching peak body condition. And, just give a shout out. This is wildlife technician Jesse Dunshee, and he is a sheep enthusiast as well. And with that, Mike, I would like to turn it over to Joe.
Okay, Joe, you're up. I hope you're out there. Okay, and we see your note. We see your. We don't see the presenter. Okay, there you go. You're good.
How's that go? Can you hear me, Mike?
Yeah, we hear you.
Yep, we hear you. Yep.
Okay, we're on a roll then. Well, first I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to listen to this presentation, and we'll get started. And what I'm going to do is go over some of just the general history of sheep in Alaska and some of the management things that we've dealt with over the years. And it's from a historical standpoint and perspective. And one of the things I guess that I've come to realize, even though when I was in school, I apparently didn't, is the importance of this historical perspective. And when we look at Alaska, we see several major events that took place as far as game management goes. And one of those was the 1902 Game Act. And then in 1925, they created the Alaska Game Commission, the AGC. And what that did was when Alaska became a territory in 1912, there was a lot of interest in bringing the management of game to a closer local level, which was prior to that, it had been done. Most of the management decisions had been made in Washington with very little input from Alaska. But once we became a territory in 1912, there was a movement to bring the management decisions as far as game goes closer to Alaska. Then in 1950, for the first time, we went to a 3/4 curl restriction and a permit hunt. And this, from a standpoint of sheep, was a major step. And then in 1980, we went to full curl, not necessarily statewide, but we started to implement full curl regulations in a piecemeal manner throughout the state. Going back to the early 1800s, it's interesting that in just after 1800, the Russians transplanted 11 wild goats on Kodiak. And it appears that they had them in an enclosure and tried to raise them, but it was unsuccessful. In the early 1800s, the Russians imposed a local tax on the indigenous people of 5 sheep per year, or, and I don't quite understand, it's 3 marmots. But Dall sheep were recognized as an important meat protein source as early as the 1800s. Then, ironically, in 1848, Trebenkov, who was the general manager for the Russian American Company, transplanted, it was 11 or 12 wild sheep to Kodiak. It's interesting that we cannot find out whatever happened to them, although they obviously did not take. Then in the late 1890s, there developed a real interest in trophy hunting on the Kenai Peninsula. And this resulted in expeditions where they would take, some of those expeditions would take 12, 14 sheep, and then a phenomenal number of bears, caribou, and moose. This created a real conservation concern, to where enough so that conservationists or hunters approached the Congress and implemented and were instrumental in getting the 1902 Game Act passed. As I said, it was, in addition to that, about this time, because of mining and commercial hunting of different game species in Alaska, there was a real resource concern. Some of these hunting parties at that time, hunting trips consisted of like a 6-month trip, 2 or 3 months to get a train ride to Seattle, and 2 or 3 months on a ship, on a boat to get to the Gulf of Alaska, and then a couple months of hunting, and then another 2 or 3 months to get back, so that when they went on these trips, they harvested some fairly large numbers of game. Mining at this time also took off, and there was a need to supply these mining camps with game, and some of those, and the numbers don't necessarily, the numbers do not seem to be accurate, but some of those numbers are pretty extensive. In 1913, they indicate that 2,000 sheep were harvested in order to supply one mining camp for the winter. Now, how accurate that 2,000 is, we don't know. All of these concerns led to Congress passing the 1902 Game Act, which was though certainly a step forward, enforcement proved to be a challenge. Some laws were simply ignored, while others were circumvented by acquiring collection permits on the hunter standpoint. It's kind of interesting because hunters and expeditions were hunting expeditions were one of those involved in hunting expeditions were one of the primary motivators behind the 1902 Act. But once it was implemented, then a number of them circumvented the laws by getting collector's permits for museums. It's amazing as I look through history how much time has passed and how few things have changed as far as figuring out a way to circumvent regulations. Then in 1902, when they passed that, that was the first time that we set seasons for big game in Alaska. And for sheep, we set the season was set at 1 September through 15 September with an annual bag limit of 4 rams or 4 males. And that same regulation prohibited the harvest of females or their young. And it looks like, from a historical perspective, that I was fairly well respected. In rural Alaska, interesting enough, as I well remember my first sheep hunt, just kidding, of course. Sheep were an important source of protein. Then in 1925, which was the next major step, the Alaska Game Commission was established, and it was empowered to establish game regulations, seasons, bag limits, and methods and means. And this was a mechanism by which the local people could have local game management was brought down to a local level. And one of the things that's very interesting when you look at it from a historical perspective is how important the input was of local individuals and how much influence they had over these seasons and the management of game in Alaska. We see the same thing today with the modern day board of game where the public submits proposals, comments from proposals, and then an independent board or a board of game makes decisions. During this time, it was interesting that because of protein, one of the things that happened was that the University of Alaska underwent a hybridization program where they tried to develop a community where a program where they took wild sheep and hybridized them with domestic sheep. This program lasted about 5 years, but apparently was not successful. The other thing that happened during this period after the Alaska formation of the Alaska Game Commission was that they were still dealing with the commercial use of wildlife. And one of the things which is the result of Sam White patrols who operated from about 1925 to the late 30s was the poaching of game. And in this case, one of the cases that he made against a poacher was it happened to be a dry creek over by the Wood River. They confiscated 2 cow moose, 2 caribou, and 51 sheep. Now, even though these numbers sound like a lot, if you look at the overall numbers that are attributed to commercial hunting, there's some question as to how much impact they necessarily had on the resource, although certainly that's not an excuse for harvesting that number of animals. Then we move on to the 1940s, and in the 1940s in Alaska, we saw a whole series of closures on a territorial-wide basis. And those closures were based on there was a lot of concern about the military buildup in Fort Richardson at the beginning of World War II, where the influx of military personnel, there was a lot of concern about the harvest of sheep. Then there was a series of bad winters in 1946 and 1945 through 1946 was one of the most severe winters that they had on record. And in the Denali National Park, they estimated that the sheep population dropped to about 500. Now, the interesting thing is about this time, Adolph Murray was doing his work in Denali Park. And one of the benefits of his work was it showed the mortality slope, which Brad had shown earlier. And essentially from collecting skulls, it was determined that during the first year to 2 years of life, the mortality slope was pretty steep. Then it more or less leveled out and didn't have nearly the same steepness of incline. And then after about 7 to 8 years, it started to go down again at a pretty steep rate, which suggested that those animals, once they got to be 7 to 8 years old, their chances of reaching the next age class were considerably reduced. So the steeper the slope, the greater the mortality rate. So that between the ages of about 2 and 7, it's not flat, but it's certainly doesn't enjoy the same degree of slope that it did at 1 to 2. And then for the last 4 years, 3 or 4 years of life, it increases dramatically. Based in part on this, and based on the work that Robert Scott did, and Robert Scott in the late 1940s did a lot of survey work in Alaska. They surveyed essentially the whole state in 1949 and came up with some population levels, so that in 1950, they implemented the first 3/4 curl regulation in Alaska. And this regulation was implemented in the Chugach and Talkeetna mountains, with 20 permits being available to each mountain range. And the method, it looks like the motivation behind this was, one, to protect females, because up until that time, the only restriction had been was to divide males from females. Were prohibited from being harvested, but you could harvest males. But it looks like when you look at the some of the old reports that there was a lot, I don't know about a lot, but there certainly was confusion or they were concerned about the number of females being harvested. The other thing about going to 3/4 curl was that they felt that it prevented overharvest by protecting those younger age classes, which was more or less what Murray had found in his McKinley study. In 1950, the permit hunt, which as I said, there were 20 permits for the Talkeetnas and 20 permits for the Chugachs. They had 233 applicants for the 40 permits. Of the 40 permits, there were 12 sheep harvested. In 1951, which is kind of interesting, maybe it says something about the mindset. They decided to open up the permits unlimited, but they had to apply for unlimited permits. With unlimited permits, they issued 583, and the premise behind that, or thinking behind that, was we'll issue all the permits that people want, and we'll see where they hunt. It looks like, given the safety net of being a 3/4 curl, which ironically in Alaska, that's the first time that was implemented. And the only record I've been able to find so far where degree of curl was used as a controlling mechanism for the harvest of sheep was in Wyoming in the years between 1921 and 1922. 1921 to 22, Wyoming went to a half curl regulation and then maintained that on the books until 1928 through 29. Now, I don't know that Alaska was a leader in it, but certainly as we look at the history of the 3/4 curl regulation, a number of states and provinces, I believe, after that started to adopt the same process. In 1951, out of 583 permits issued, 90 sheep were harvested. Now, that does not reflect the number of sheep that were, the number of people that actually participated in the hunt. In 1952, they again left it pretty much open. They did not restrict the number of permits issued, and it was 906 permits with only 73 sheep harvested. The next major step was when we went to full curl. And some of the premise for full curl was that though from a legal criteria, we went to full curl to 360 degrees or 8 years of age or both horns being broken. And again, the premise on that is that it's pretty hard to overharvest a population with those kind of restrictions, although there may be some biological issues as were brought to light by Wayne Heimer's study in the mid 70s as to whether or not that's absolutely accurate. But we do know that from a standpoint of available animals for harvest, it's pretty hard to overharvest at full curl. They may shoot them down to full curl, although in Brad's foreign morphometric study, which I think he's going to address later on, we have not seen that in Alaska to date. So that when we look at full curl, one of the things that happened with full curl was that, I'll just go ahead forward. In the early 1970s in Alaska, let me go back to that. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have skipped over that. When we look at full curl, and we look at the criteria for full curl, usually it's 3. We're using 3 different criteria. One is it to be 8 years of age or older, full curl, or that both horns be broken. So that once an animal becomes 8 years of age, it's absolutely legal for harvest. But we have some animals that become full curl at less than 7 years, and some of that are broken for less than 7 years. That's why this red area extends up past the 8-year mark. And we have a few 7-year-olds that are full curl. And we every once in a while, in fact, this fall we had one that was 4 years old and a good clean full curl, which is very unusual. It's very seldom that we see a 5-year-old, and once in a while a 6 and some 7s, and then by the time they're 8, there's a much higher percentage of them that are full curl. In the early 1970s, we established a tote management area with a full curl criteria, and then that for full curl criteria, it was only full curl. We did not have the criteria of being 8 years of age or that both horns be broken. And I think that from a management standpoint, those are important considerations because they make available for harvest a pool of animals that otherwise we would not be able to harvest. And I'm not suggesting that because the animal's there, we have to harvest it. However, if they are available, I think it's important that we be able, that people have the opportunity to harvest them. The other thing that happened in the mid-70s is on the Kenai Peninsula, we had an interesting permit hunt where if it was less than full curl or greater than full curl, you could get a permit to harvest it. That program was in place for several years, and then it was finally disbanded. And maybe Tom Lohuis could better address that permit hunt than what I can from just looking at it from a historical standpoint. By the early 80s, we had gone to 7/8 curl in most places in the state of Alaska, and that means that we had lived under or been sheep hunting had been regulated under 3/4 curl for about 30 years. But then for a variety of reasons, part of them biological, and then in a larger, and maybe in, I don't know about a larger part, but in another part because of the attitude of hunters and sheep hunters in general, the criteria, as long as I've been involved in, has been pretty much full curl, although certainly the legal standard was less than that. So when it became time to raise it to 7/8 or the full curl, I don't know that there was a lot of resistance within the hunting community. And the other thing that's interesting is in the 1950 hunt, in the 51 hunt, when they harvested, when the standard was 3/4 curl, more than half of those animals that were harvested were over full curl, and with very few of them being marginal. And that's one of the things that's very interesting to me from a historical standpoint is how much these things have not changed in the last 50 or 100 years. Although we tend to think there's a tendency to believe that every time we go through another one of these cycles, we're facing a new crisis that no one has faced before. But the irony is that it's all been seen before, kind of like a big merry-go-round. I guess it gives us all another opportunity to solve problems. By the late 80s or early 90s, most of Alaska was under full curl regulation. And when we went to a full curl regulation from the standpoint of it being statewide, they added the age criteria and the broken horn or broomed, as it was called at that time, to the criteria that would enable it to be harvested. And again, I think that's an important component because it allows for us to harvest animals that otherwise would not be eligible for harvest, not necessarily that we have to harvest them. I guess having spent a lot of time hunting, one of the things that's been really of interest to me is this historical perspective, because when I look at it from a historical perspective, it's kind of like we sometimes think we need to reinvent the wheel, but from a historical standpoint, people before us have gone through the same things and same trials and tribulations that we are today. It's the same when we look at the fluctuation in sheep populations. There have been some pretty dramatic die-offs in the past, and they've recovered. Now, that's not to suggest that we don't need to be aware of these issues and deal with them, but we really need to take a closer look at history to see what has gone on in the past so that we can better predict what's going to go on in the future. And in closing, I would really like to thank everybody for taking the time to listen to this talk. And it was kind of the first time I've given it. And I'm going to turn it back over to Brad or Tom because I'm really excited about what they have to say. And once again, I really appreciate everybody taking the time to listen to this workshop or this seminar and all the biologists that have worked in the past to deal with this, Robert Taylor, Wayne Heimer. There's just a list that goes on Bill Jacks, Tony Smith. I mean, the list goes on, and I could go another hour and list all the people that have made some real meaningful contributions to sheep management, to the long-term well-being of sheep, which we're all very interested in. I think that's one of the reasons we're here. And I can't overemphasize the importance from a historical standpoint or what we see today of public participation in the process. Because as vast as these areas are, and as good as the biologists and research individuals we have, they have to have the input of those people who are in the field, because no one can be in all these drainages all the time. So when we have like a sealing program in Alaska, where when those hunters come in, and I've been involved in that for the last 5 years, it's really meaningful to listen to one hunter come in and talk about, and legitimately so, they were in a drainage and didn't see any rams, and that's quite legitimate. the next hunter comes in, he came out of there with a nice ram. And it's important to have that balanced perception. And the only way that biologists or managers can get that perception is if the public participates. And once again, I really thank everybody for taking the time to be involved in this and to listen to this talk. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Joe. Brad, are you back? You got to unshare, Joe. Thank you.
Okay, one sec. Do you see it, Mike?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna leave my camera off this time to avoid what happened last time. I'm just going to kind of give an update on the kind of where we are in the current status of sheep in Alaska. And the first graph I'm going to start with is just a historical perspective of the total amount of hunters that are participating in our hunts. On the x-axis, we're going to start, the data I have go from 1977 to present. And on the y-axis is a total number of hunters. As you can see, we kind of like peaked in the late 80s and early 90s, and we've kind of been on a downward slope, a decreasing participation during this time. Now, I did a pooled average. From 1980 to 2000, during those years, we averaged about 3,100 sheep hunters a year. Now, then looking at 2001 till present, I excluded this year because we're probably still waiting on a few harvest tickets. We're down to about 2,552 sheep hunters a year. So we have far less people going out hunting, but maybe a little bit better access, and also points in an overall from a fish and game standpoint, like we need to get better at recruiting and retaining some hunters out there. Now, I looked at the relationship between the total number of hunters and the total sheep harvest, and this is based on all mountain ranges pooled together. But there is somewhat of a linear relationship between the total number of hunters and the sheep harvested. But you need to interpret that with a little bit of a caution. Hunters may self-regulate to some degree if they perceive overall sheep numbers to be down. Vacation time is limited for a lot of folks, and most sheep hunts take quite a bit of time and money. Okay, so what we have on the x-axis is we have year, and on the y-axis we have total harvest over time. Harvest tickets were first issued in 1962, but that data point maybe take a little bit of caution because getting compliance with reporting harvest may not have happened. But between 1962 and 2020, the average number of sheep harvested each season has been 985 animals, with that range between 628 and 1,454. The fall of 2020 was the lowest harvest that we had on record until this current hunting season of 2021, where we have a harvest of 474 animals. Comparing current harvest to the long-term average is confounded because early harvest happened before Anilka, thus more area was open to hunting. Some areas that were general season have gone to draw hunt, thus limiting the opportunity. And hunter participation has decreased, as shown in the previous slide. However, some of our department's summer survey data, as well as anecdotal reports from hunters, suggest that we are seeing and experiencing some substantial level of population decline in many ranges across the state. The low harvest of 20 and 21 can partially be explained by poor lamb crops in the 2012, 2013, 2014 lambing season. Poor recruitment of lambs from those years is most likely weather related. The winter of 2011, 2012 brought record snow depths to much of the state, and 2012, 2013 was also characterized by extreme snow depths. Further, The winter of 2012 and 2013 ended with over 2 feet of snow falling May 18th through 20th in much of south central Alaska. And those late snows likely killed many lambs that had been born earlier that year. So the literature supports that in many cases, extreme winter conditions result in a carryover effect where you have low pregnancy rates and poor body condition that persists for at least another additional year after stressful conditions are experienced. Female sheep handled and sampled between 2012 and 2014 in the Chugach and Talkeetna mountain ranges evidenced poor body condition and record low population pregnancy rates of 18 to 44% in some of those years. And just for reference, most healthy ungulate populations see consistent pregnancy rates of 85 to 100% in adult females. The poor lamb production during the 2012 and 2014 was also exacerbated by poor adult survival in the winters of 2019 to 2020 and 2020-2021. Many male lambs born during that period would have started to become legal for harvest under the full curl old regulation in the 2020 hunting season. And like we showed, Joe and I both showed, the mortality curves for Dall sheep have been published by multiple researchers. And in general, mortality is low for those ages 2 to 8. However, over winter mortality rates in the collared animals in some areas were much greater than expected, during both those previous winters. In the winter of 2019 and 2020, 34% of all radio-collared sheep in the Talkeetna Mountains died from a variety of causes ranging from avalanches, predation, disease, falls, and malnutrition. During the winter of 2020, during the winter of 2020-2021, 19% of all collared sheep, including 23% of the collared rams in the Talkeetnas, also died from the same causes. Similar declines were noted in aerial surveys and other game management units. For reference, data from radio-collared sheep in the Chugach, Wrangell, and Talkeetna mountains between 2008 to present show that in most winters, overall adult survival rates are between 88 and 92%. And these are similar to survival rates that were reported by Steve Arthur in the Brooks Range and the Alaska Range. Poor lamb production and overwinter survival was not limited to populations south of the Alaska Range. A federal counterpart, Kumi Rattenberry, published in 2018, they reported that lamb production was negatively related to the annual timing and the end of a continuous snow season and was near zero in Arctic areas in 2013. The 2013 event was also associated with approximately 40 to 70% declines in overall sheep numbers in Arctic areas, indicating that adult survival was also impacted. That said, population cycles have occurred before. And I'll just repeat a little bit what Joe said. For example, in the 1940s, managers had substantial concern about declining sheep numbers in the Talkeetna and Chugach Mountains. In response to those concerns, they had a complete sheep closure followed by a limited draw permit where 20 permits were issued. And so I guess the point is we have seen, we've gone through these crashes before, but what I want to do is kind of give a more contemporary example of a more recent population crash and kind of go through the history of game management 20A. 20A sits just south of Fairbanks, Alaska, for folks that are calling in from out of the state. And it has a longest history of sheep hunting. Now, the first slide I want to show, and in this figure, which is it's not perfect, but I'm using harvest as a crude measure of population size. Now, sheep populations, the harvest in this game management unit was high, and during a period where we were evolving from 3/4 curl to 7/8 curl to full curl management. However, we had an extreme weather event in the winter of 1992 and 1993. And the point I want to make here is that managers chose to keep this hunt structured as a general harvest hunt, open to both residents and non-residents. And now, although it took on the order of magnitude of 15, 20 years to grow out of that low until our most recent drop again, the sheep populations did return to pre-level crashes, again, peaking in about 2019. And lastly, I just want to show, so this was pre-crash, and we're on a slight increasing trajectory. But after that the weather event prior to this current population level we're in, they grew at a far substantial, a greater rate. So there's concern that with a warming environment in Alaska, we may be witnessing a paradigm shift in Dall sheep densities. The Arctic is warming at twice the rate of lower latitudes, and temperatures by some researchers are predicted to rise by as much as 3 to 6 degrees Celsius by the year 2080. Recently published literature suggests that adult sheep survival is negatively associated with increased wintertime freeze-thaw events. And I just want to point out to this graph up here for everybody that's in Fairbanks in Alaska. This was a total rainfall that we're experiencing between December 25th and December 28th of just this last year. So if you're in Fairbanks, you know what a mess it is. Furthermore, there's like evidence that with a warming environment, we could start lose habitat as we see shrubbification going up the mountains. And with decreased habitat, that could potentially lead to a decreased carrying capacity in many ranges. And I'll just point out to this picture here, staff out of Fairbanks were in the foothills of the Alaska Range. This is on October 4th, doing a caribou count, and they had almost 2 feet of snow on the ground on October 4th. So while concern is certainly warranted and appropriate, as a department, we're recommending a position of watchful waiting. If population trajectories, as in the past, return to positive, then no action will be necessary. And lastly, after some of that depressing talk, and to end this on a positive note, there is a potential upshot to having sheep in low density. Specifically, sheep that are born or are young during a population lows tend to grow horns at a faster rate. That's published by Hike and Carey and Lair. There's a couple papers out there. And I want to show that this was observed after that population crash in 28. This is just a 28 data. And so the biggest horns that we recorded were happening right after that crash in the 1995, 96, 97, 98. So leaving that on a positive note. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Tom.
Okay, can you guys
Got
hear
it, Mike?
Mike, you got me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I don't see your presentation yet, though.
I'm just moving a little slow here.
No problem.
Okay. How's that? Can you see that now?
No, not yet.
How about now?
It's coming up. It's coming up now. Okay, we got you
good.
full screen. You look good.
Good. Good evening. My name's Tom Lohuis. I'm the sheep research biologist for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game based in South Central. And I'm excited to talk with you guys tonight about the work we've been doing in the Chugach and then subsequently the Talkeetnas over the last 12 years or so. If you've seen some of my talks before, some of this will be familiar, and then we'll branch out into what we've been doing recently. If you haven't seen it, this will be a real good background about how we started, why we chose our study areas, what we found in those study areas, and how the project has evolved ever since we started in 2009. Before we really dive into the meat of the study, I want to highlight that I'm privileged to be the face of this effort, but it's very much a collaborative project. It wouldn't have been possible for me to do this alone. There's been a lot of time and dedication from a number of biologists and technicians and aircraft folks, pilots who gave very generously of their time, their effort. Technicians who'd crawl into the back of the Cub in marginal weather or 20 below, getting up early to warm aircraft so we could go do capture work before it got too bad. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Kyle Smith, who started with the department as a technician, became one of my graduate students, is now a friend and a co-author on this project. So this work belongs to all of us. I do get to have the joy of presenting it, but this is very much a collaborative team effort. And so also, as we go through the presentation, I've tried to illustrate some points in the talk with the background slides. And if I forget, I'm sorry, but I hope to use the slides to illustrate a little bit of the data points that we'll be talking about. So our first study area was Game Management Unit 13D. If you're Alaskan, you know this is about 150 miles northeast of Anchorage, between Anchorage and Glen Allen, up on the Glen Highway. And we chose 13D primarily because area biologists in that area, Bob Tobey and Becky Schwanke, had a real consistent effort of documenting population declines. They'd been aggressive about flying surveys every summer and recorded the decline. They'd noted the ram and ewe numbers in that area had dropped at the same time and with the same trajectory, suggesting that something other than hunting was going on. You know, they were counting 650 to 750 odd sheep in the study area, just a portion of that game management unit, highlighted in yellow. And if you are familiar with that map, you'll notice the Matanuska Glacier is the west edge of the study area, and the Taslina is the east edge. That population had dropped to about 350 or 400 sheep by the time we started research in 2007, 2008, 2009 was when we first hung collars in that area. We'd go out in the summer, biologists would fly summertime surveys. They'd count 30 lambs per 100 ewes. But what we didn't know, for example, 30 per 100, but what we didn't know is how we'd gotten to that number. We didn't know if 100 ewes were giving birth to 100 lambs and 70 of those were being eaten by predators, or maybe only 30 were born, but all of them were surviving. So we didn't have a lot of information on what was really going on. So we shaped the initial research to establish a real baseline demographic picture, trying to establish an idea of what drives sheep population trends in South Central Alaska, specifically targeting questions like, what are pregnancy rates? What are recruitment rates? How many young animals are entering the population? And what's killing and at what rate adults and lambs? Finally, we wanted to look at disease. We'd heard some reports that disease was an issue in the lower 48. So we started with 30 ewes captured by helicopter net gunning. This is pilot Troy Cambier and Kyle net gunning here in the Chugach. And while it's exciting for us, it's extremely stressful for the animal. But I want to point out that over the life of the project, we've captured over 650 sheep and have a career capture mortality rate below about 2%. We don't use drugs. The net allows us location control. You can imagine with sheep that time between when the dart hits, when the animal goes to sleep, called induction time, they can get themselves into a lot of trouble. So it's just, it's net followed by a blindfold and physical restraint. It also helps us eliminate GI tract complications or thermoregulatory issues that accompany immobilizing chemical immobilization. We added a second study area in 2012. This was in 14C, just above Anchorage, but also in the Chugach. We'd already established our capture techniques. We felt good with the amount of animals we could handle safely. And we had a demographic picture in the northern part of the Chugach. But we needed to determine if the same demographic players were acting across the Chugach in the same ways. So we maintained 30 to 40 adult ewes. We'd capture as many of these animals as possible in each of the study area. And every year we'd look at pregnancy rates, we'd look at body condition, disease status, take samples to test for disease. And then we'd also track rates and causes of mortality. And I'll tell you how we'll do that here shortly. So remember, when we talk about pregnancy rates, I'm talking about a blood test. We're actually measuring what the ewe is carrying. This allows us to accurately assess whether or not she's pregnant, not simply just observing, which of course could be compromised by bad weather or early predation events, something like that. But one of the first things that we noticed when we started handling animals is that they were extremely skinny, even for ungulates in late winter. This photo here, Kyle and I are using an ultrasound to measure the depth of the longissimus dorsi, the backstrap muscle, on a young ram in the wrangles. We also use the ultrasound to measure body fat on the rump. But one of the first things we noticed was that these animals were really skinny, even for ungulates in late winter. They didn't have any subcutaneous fat. If you ran your hand down their back, you could feel all the bony structures of the neck and the spine, the withers and the pelvis. In many cases, there was as much as a centimeter between the spine and that underlying muscle. And you know, if you field rest a sheep in the fall, they're carrying quite a bit of fat, usually in pretty reasonable shape. We started using the ultrasound in 2016 to verify what we'd been palpating, actually, poking, prodding, and feeling in these animals. And that the ultrasound allowed us to look underneath the skin and see if, in fact, what we thought we were getting was what was there, and that was confirmed. But a couple things that we noticed were that, in addition to the bony structures evident, was the nuchal ligament, that long ligament that runs between the shoulders and the back of the neck on an animal. And on an extremely skinny sheep, or on most sheep in late winter, they're skinny enough that you can give this a pinch test. Your fingers will actually meet below that ligament. You can feel your fingers tapping underneath that. There's just no muscle there to support it. So I got back from that first field session, and I gave Steve Arthur a call. Steve was our sheep research biologist in Fairbanks before Brad. And I said, Steve, this is kind of weird. What do you see in the Brooks and the Alaska ranges? Everything I'm handling doesn't have any sub-Q fat, and they're losing muscle. And he said, that's not what we see in the Brooks and the Alaska ranges, that every animal that they'd handled were carrying some sub-Q fat and that they were well muscled. As an interesting aside, we now know that these animals are capable of becoming fat. We had a lamb that was part of our research project. It was abandoned by a newborn lamb abandoned by a ewe. We picked that lamb up and took it to the Alaska Zoo, and it was fostered. And I had the opportunity to go into that animal's cage a couple of years later and kind of scrunched my hands on her. She was just a little butterball. So they are certainly capable. Animals from this area are certainly capable of putting on fat and being well nourished. We just weren't seeing that in field animals. The next red flag we noticed was when we received our pregnancy data back from the lab. Most healthy ungulate populations, between 90 and 100% of mature females are pregnant. And Mary Wood, who's a British Columbia biologist, works on stone sheep, reported a 95% pregnancy rate in the project she did over 4 years. So stones are close cousins to Dalls. And that 62% pregnancy rate that you see there on the GMU 13D column was the first one we measured. Things fluctuated a little bit, but seeing pregnancy rates in the 60s and bumping into the maybe low 70s were concerning. But then in 2012 and 2014, we had some record low pregnancy rates. And interestingly enough, those are the lowest rates I've ever found reported in any ungulate population anywhere. So it's pretty clear that there was something else going on. So we'd observed a couple red flags, but we needed to check that picture out with what was really happening on with a sheep on the ground. So for several years, we checked radiocalorie animals twice a month, given weather and daylight. When lambs were on the ground, we'd collar them. I'll talk about that in a little bit. We checked them daily, mid-May to mid-June. The important point here is that we spent a lot of time in the back of a cub, and we get a mortality. We'd go in and try to determine the cause of death as quickly as possible. The radio collar is designed to give off a mortality signal that you can hear from through your radio receiver. So we'd get a helicopter, go in and investigate. Now, in general, it's pretty easy to figure out what was going on. One thing to point out is if there was presence of a predator at a mortality site, either tracks or scat or other indicators like the blood on this sheep collar, we attributed that kill to the predator. Now, this may have led to that specific predator. For example, wolf tracks, wolf kill, Wolverine tracks, Wolverine kill. Now, this may have given us a slight overestimate of the predation, but I don't think it was by that much, mostly because with our frequent checks, we found intact carcasses like this that hadn't been scavenged. Now, this picture is actually fairly unique to sheep research in the Chugach. finding an intact carcass is something that Steve never experienced in the brooks. And keep this in mind. I'll bring it back up in a few slides and we'll discuss it. And in this case, we were able to helicopter this carcass out and have Dr. Kathy Burek do a necropsy for us. Dr. Burek's a board certified veterinary pathologist in Eagle River. She's a total badass, and she's contracted to do necropsies on federally listed endangered species. So I mentioned this just to point out we had an expert doing the necropsies and the pathology for us. There wasn't just a couple of biologists out in the field hacking and slashing. This individual had developed a uterine infection, which subsequently became septic and killed the animal. Other times, it was pretty easy to determine the cause of death, but a little bit harder to recover the collar or the carcass. After digging out a few like this, we just started waiting until September, letting the sun and warm temperatures do our work for us. So rates and causes of mortality turned out to be very, very consistent between our study areas. This pie chart shows the fate of study animals in the 14C Chugach, right above Anchorage. But the picture from 13D is almost identical. What was consistent was that about in any given year, 13 or so % of animals perished for a variety of causes. In the 14C Chugach was avalanches, wolverines, brown bear, predation, complications from giving birth. And that picture held in both game management units. Over 317 sheep years of research, we had 41 mortalities, which leads to 13% of adult mortality every year. So those numbers compare very, very, they're very similar to what Steve Arthur reported in the Alaska and the Brooks ranges. But here's where the story diverges and gets a little bit interesting. The causes of mortality in these populations are very different. So in the Alaska and the Brooks ranges and Steve Arthur's projects, virtually all of the adult mortality that they measured was caused by predators, wolves, wolverines, some bears. In the Chugach, only about 1 out of every 4 or every 5 animals was killed by predation. I'm confident in making that assessment because of the way we consistently found intact carcasses in the Chugach project. So as we were building this picture of what was happening to the adult population, we also needed to get a look at the newborns and the lambs. We knew which ewes were pregnant from blood tests, but we wanted to see how many lambs were being born and how many were surviving. So during late May and June, we'd look at these animals from a super cub. We'd observe a lamb, bring a helicopter in and land above the lambing site, stalk, hike, sneak downhill, grab the lamb, weigh it, and then move on and release that little guy underneath a rock ledge. We'd put a radio collar on it and descend away from the lambing site to minimize disturbance as best we could. Over the course of the project, we handled and collared and tracked about 155 lambs. In most cases, like this picture shows, the ewe would return as quickly as she could as we left the lambing site. If you look closely, you can see the collar showing on that little bright white collar on that newborn lamb over on the left side. There was, as I mentioned, 1 lamb that was abandoned by the ewe during our capture process. We recovered that, and that lamb was fostered at the Alaska Zoo. And 2 more were killed by eagles before the ewe was able to return to the capture site. So we removed those 3 from the data set and then fly daily between the 15th of May or so and the 15th of June to check the lambs. This individual was killed by pneumonia caused by a severe lungworm infestation. And at this point, we were doing necropsies on as many animals as we could, looking for mycoplasma pneumonia. And if you've been in the sheep world for a while, you've heard that. I'll speak more about it in a little bit. But we didn't find any evidence of major disease in either adults or lambs. Again, it's worth mentioning that it's worth mentioning that we would consistently recover intact carcasses when lambs were killed by non-predation causes. Predation causes were also very, very noticeable and with the same methodology used on our adults. If there was evidence of a predator at that site, we attributed the mortality to that predator. It turned out to be very easy to differentiate between predator species. Each one has a characteristic signature. This is an eagle kill. They'd consume the soft tissue and typically leave the long bones intact. Frequently, they'd break the brain case open and consume the brain as well. Brown bears peel a carcass just like my 14-year-old will eat a tangerine. They'll eat the carcass, bones and all, and leave just the rind. Oop, a little too quick there. Wolverines were effective predators on lambs during the winter, especially after wind events had created a crust. They'd eat most of the carcass, but often leave you a long bone or a jaw intact. If you look closely, there's a jawbone just to the right and below the radio collar in the center of the picture. Their teeth marks on the collar canister were also very distinctive. Accidents, as Brad mentioned, drowning killed a fair number. Falls and rock slides as well. As Joe and Brad pointed out, animals experience high mortality from a variety of causes early in life. They starve to death. This photo shows bone marrow from an animal that starved, January of 2010. It has that characteristic strawberry jam look of marrow from an animal that starved. Bone marrow in a healthy animal, if you've cracked a long bone during hunting season, you know it's creamy white. That marrow contains a lot of fat. And as the animals become nutritionally stressed, they start to metabolize the fat. The marrow becomes pink. And then as the last is burned off, the marrow appears like this. So it's very easy to diagnose a starvation death. Lamb survival rates were, as Brad mentioned, variable, depending on weather, predation, and other events, but were remarkably similar in both study areas. So again, I'm only going to show data from one study area just for simplicity. There's a lot of data presented in this slide. I'm not trying to make anybody sick with a pinwheel, but the important point to take home here is that about a third of the lambs in this study area, 13D, survived, shown in green. A third were killed by predators, depicted by warmer colors, and the remaining third killed by non-predation causes. If we look a little bit more closely at the third or so of the lambs killed by predators, we see that eagles, shown in gold, golden eagles, took the largest fraction of the lamb crop at about 11%. Brown bears, green, sorry, too close to gold, and too close to wolverines for them to get their own color. But brown bears and wolverines took about 6% apiece, followed by wolves, coyotes, and black bears. Of course, in some cases, multiple predators had visited that site, so we were unable to definitively attribute the cause of death to a specific predator species. Cooler colors here show losses to accidents, avalanches, falls, and rock slides. Even when we couldn't find a specific culprit, most of the time we could differentiate between predation and non-predation losses due to broken bones and scattered hair. Interestingly, I was fascinated that avalanches killed about as many lambs as eagles did, combined with both study areas and with the adult mortality, making avalanches the biggest single killer of sheep in the Chugach project. So again, the overall survival numbers, though variable, are very, very consistent with what Steve measured in the Alaska and Brooks ranges. But just like our data on adult sheep, predation accounts for far less lambs in the Chugach than it does in other ranges. Steve Arthur and another researcher, Brad Scotton's work in the Alaska range, indicates that coyotes and eagles were the major players on lambs there, with wolverines and eagles taking the majority of lambs out of Brooks range populations. This is a summary slide that Steve and I put together for a scientific talk in 2018. And I just included this because I really like the way it shows differences in lamb fates across several different mountain ranges. The 14C Chugach on the top left, 13D North Central Chugach, top right, 24A Brooks Range, and 20A Alaska Range on the bottom right-hand side. Well, the number of lambs that survived in each area, which is shown in green, is pretty similar. The losses to predators in red are much, much greater in the Brooks in 24A and in the Alaska Range in 20A. So what does that mean as far as conclusions? What can we draw from this data set? Well, we know that predation accounts for far less Chugach sheep than it does in other ranges, 1 out of 4 to 1 out of 6 adults, and a third of the lambs. So I think that the low level of loss and the broad distribution of mortality across multiple predator species points to points to the fact that Chugach populations are not being limited by predation. And we saw a low level presence of major wildlife diseases. We didn't see population level effects or major die-offs. So that leaves us with a couple of things that stand out. We saw some low and variable pregnancy rates. We saw consistent poor body condition. And that suggests that nutrition and habitat weather conditions are driving our lamb production and our population changes. So this was a turning point when we realized that lamb production was the bottleneck. We realized it was time to start looking at habitat, how sheep were using the landscape, and try to figure out how to measure what they were actually getting from that landscape, from that habitat. So at a scientific meeting in 2017 or thereabouts, I had a conversation with Roman Dall. Roman's a professor at Alaska Pacific University and a well-known adventurer. He's a nut. He'll spend weeks and weeks walking across the breadth of the Brooks Range doing foot-supported research trips. And during that conversation, Roman mentioned that some of the work he'd done documented that brush lines, alders and dwarf birch were moving upslope at very, very fast rates, sometimes as much as 1.3 meters, almost 4 feet in a year. Sheep are grazers. So when you think about increased woody brush moving up into sheep habitat, that suggests that there's less leafy green stuff for them to eat. So if you look at this picture, Peters Creek in Game Management Unit 14C, I know there's at least one person on the Zoom call here who's killed a very nice ram off the left side of that peak. And yes, it's a drawing hunt. You can see how if the lower slopes, I like this photo because it illustrates that if the lower slopes become brushy, sheep habitat gets smaller in a hurry. Brush grows up the hillside, but the rock at the top doesn't just magically turn into grass. So there's less available habitat. And if you limit that habitat as brush moves uphill, there's just going to be less area available. As the elevation increases, that circumference of that mountain decreases. So losing even a little bit of that lowest elevation sheep habitat could have a substantial impact on the nutrition that's available. So that conversation and subsequent other ones generated 3 research questions. Are we losing habitat? Do summer growing season conditions change nutritional quality? Are they limited in some way by what they're eating? Are they not getting quality nutrition? And what about wintertime? What happens during the winter? So we'll take these questions one at a time. First, have we lost sheep habitat? Roman had documented through some of his remote sensing work that shrubline was advancing 3 to 4 feet a year in parts of the Kenai and the Chugach Mountains. I took this picture in Ram Valley above Eagle River. You look in the near foreground, you can see willow and dwarf birch growing up into the alpine tundra. And if you look closely, there's a young spruce tree showing up through the snow on the right-hand side of the photo. So this is an example of where brush is growing up and limiting sheep habitat. We threw this question at Kyle for his master's work. Kyle used data from 30-ish GPS collared sheep along with satellite imagery to try to build a digital picture of what sheep habitat looks like and how sheep were using that. So that gave us a picture of what's going on right now. And we're hoping to be able to use that in future years to assess if there's been a decrease in habitat, if there's less of it 10 years from now. Also to see if they're using habitat differently in the future as vegetation changes from alpine tundra to low woody shrub. The second question, does the nutritional content of sheep forage change as a result of warmer and drier summer weather? And this is where my really nerdy physiologist side gets excited. We know that the growing fetus needs energy. The most biochemically efficient way to do that is to feed it sugar, glucose. And the most efficient way to do that for animals, for ruminants, is to break down protein. One of our biologists, Beth Leonard, did her master's work on caribou forage, and she found that sometimes forage plants grow less nutritious forage during warm, dry summers than those that grow in cool, wet conditions. So we threw this question at graduate student Luke Methrel, and Luke spent 3 summers living out of a backpack following sheep around the Chugach. He'd watch them eat, identify which species of plant they were foraging on, and collect those plant samples. Later in the lab, he measured nutritional content. He's currently looking at the data to see if the forage from hot and dry summers is less nutritious than that which grows in cool, moist ones. And we should hear from Luke later this spring as he wraps up his writing and defends his master's thesis. Finally, how does snowpack affect foraging and habitat use? How does it affect movement? We know historically that some early sheep research looked at this. We're going to try to look at it a little bit more rigorously. Jake Liebman, who's an engineer by training, started a master's program just this fall at Alaska Pacific University with Roman and Jason Geck. And Jake is trying to figure out ways to measure snowpack. Here he's assembling a temperature sensor in Peters Creek, and there's a remote time-lapse camera as well as a temperature sensor on that to measure actual weather conditions. And he'll combine that data with data from GPS collared animals to see how they move given different snow conditions in the alpine. I spoke a little bit about disease as well. And Dr. Beckmen will speak in detail about this, but many of us know that we detected mycoplasma ovonemonia, which is a bacteria that has been implicated in bighorn sheep die-offs in the lower 48 in samples from hunter harvested animals in 2017 and 2018. Dr. Beckmen led a large scale effort to sample statewide. We also simultaneously wanted to take a closer look at animals in different age classes and sex classes than just what hunters are harvesting to see on a fine scale what we were seeing in terms of mycoplasma ovonemonia presence in other animals. And since I'm not a diseased biologist, the best way for me to do this was to pawn it off on a couple of experts. So we lined up a project with Dr. Helen Schwanche and Dr. Kylie Thacker, Stone's sheep wildlife veterinarians and good friends and colleagues that work for the British Columbia Ministry of Forests, Land, and Natural Resource Development. And we brought them in to do the heavy lifting for us. And we collared and handled 40 sheep in the Talkeetnas and another 20 in the 14C Chugach in February of 2019. And this is a 4-year project where I ideally hoping to track disease status of the individuals through time. And the first 2 years of this made up Kylie's master's. We looked at a broad scope of wildlife diseases. Most of the samples were run at the Washington Animal Disease Diagnostic Laboratory. And without getting too into the weeds, we found only a very low number of animals carrying mycoplasma ovonemonia. We had 3 out of 45 animals sampled in the Talkeetnas were carrying mycoplasma ovonemonia. 2 additional animals had antibodies in their blood to that bacteria that they'd been exposed to it. And a lower number were also carried antibodies to some other diseases. We found even lower disease presence in Game Management Unit 14C animals. So I don't want to get into the details. Dr. Beckmen will do that during her talk, but the short version is that mycoplasma ovonemonia and other pathogens are present in Alaska sheep, but don't appear to have severely deleterious population level effects. Animals are killed by diseases, but usually that happens in the presence of other stressors, including poor nutrition. So as we try to answer specific questions about habitat use, habitat quality, nutrition, disease, and snowpack, we're using those collars and we're simultaneously gathering information on survival rates, pregnancy, and population health. This is valuable. We see that sheep and Game Management Unit 14C have fared fairly well over the last few years. We've got consistently high survival rates with the exception of 2012, 2013, that record snow and late snow winter. Unfortunately, the populations in the Talkeetnas have been especially hard hit with very, very poor adult survival over the last couple of winters. 66% of our animals survived the winter of 2019 and 2020 in the Talkeetnas. 81% of that remainder survived in 2020 and through 2020 and 21. And as you can see, comparing the numbers from both areas, those are fairly severe declines. So I'm going to wrap this talk up here, but leave you with a couple of thoughts. We know from field work that we've had poor lamb production in 2012 and through 2014, hard winters, deep snow, late snowfall. And many of those lambs would have become legal as 7 or 8-year-olds in 2020 or 21. But those animals were hit hard by the last 2 winters. They certainly saw lower survival in a lot of areas than we would have liked to have seen. These winter conditions have been reflected in the harvest. There's a real shortage of 8 and 9-year-old sheep in the population right now.
There's about 1 million of them.
And we've unfortunately seen an uptick in the sublegal take. Over 10% of the rams that we sealed in Anchorage this year were confiscated and turned over to the wildlife troopers. So just a shout out, just to mention, be aware that there are lower numbers of mature rams on the landscape. As Brad mentioned, we hope to see that turn around. We're going to be monitoring this very, very carefully, but be really conservative when you decide to harvest a sheep going forward. I think we'll probably see a return to better conditions in 2 to 3 to 5 years, and with some luck and some good weather, an uptick. But just be aware that there are a lot of animals on the landscape that aren't quite at that legal level just yet. So I'll wrap this up here. Thank you both very much, or thank you all very much, excuse me, for taking the time. I hope this was valuable. Mike has put an email address in the comments if anybody's got further questions, if we run out of time, or wants to follow up on some detailed stuff. And before I wrap up, I want to point out, I mentioned earlier in the talk that this was a collaborative effort. And a number of people were very, very instrumental. I can't thank them all, but some real highlights were technician Mike Harrington, biologists Becky Schwanke, Tony Cavalock, Thomas McDonough, Chris Brockman, Gina Delfrati, Corey Stantorf, graduate student Brianne Bowen, biologist Wade Schock, Dave Battle, Todd Rinaldi, Tim Peltier, technician Janelle De La Pena, biologists Heidi Hatcher, Jeff Wells. Special thank you to friends and colleagues, Kylie and Helen. Thanks for the education and the fun and the great field work. And a special shout out to our aviation support crew. These are the guys that made it happen. We couldn't have done it without Mike Meekin, generously opened his home and hangar to us. Mike Litzen, who's always willing to fly and just such a good hand in the bad weather. Matt Keller, Mark Shelton, David Rivers, Tommy Levanger, Chris Jordan, Troy Cambier. Just a privilege to work with helicopter pilots like these guys, Joe Fieldman, Brandon Sylvie, Chris Ramsey, and Harley McMahon. Thanks to everybody that made this happen and made it possible for me to talk about this project. Thanks. I'll turn it back to you, Mike.
Okay, thanks, Tom. It looks like you were able to unshare. So we have one more presentation from Dr. Beckman and about MOV. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take about a 2-minute break, and then we'll, time permitting, we'll start trying to work our way through some questions for everybody. But Kimberlee, if you are up, then you're on, and it looks good.
Okay, thanks. Sorry. I'm just going to give you a very brief highlights of and get to some conclusions from the mycoplasma oven pneumonia research that we've done for the past few years. Let's see here. So Tom mentioned about mycoplasma oven pneumoniae, but this is a bacteria that has been responsible for pneumonia outbreaks and bighorn sheep and causing large scale population die-offs with a lot of disease and mortality among those among bighorn sheep. So those outbreaks have also been associated with poor lamb survival and subsequent population declines. And studies in bighorn sheep have also showed a lower resistance and more severe disease in bighorn sheep when they're exposed to additional domestic sheep pathogens, or when they've been already infected with MOV. And importantly, there is no apparent cross immunity from previous outbreaks with MOV when they're exposed to another genotype or strain. And I want you to file that away in your brain, because we're going to talk about that at the end. And because the impact of this organism, MOV, on bighorn sheep populations, and also reports that it caused mortalities in Norwegian muskox and Dall sheep in the zoo, we were concerned that this bacteria could have an impact on Alaska wildlife. So we'd always been on the lookout for it. But during our routine disease surveillance work, we had detected a different mycoplasma that was in moose, and it appeared to be unique to moose. And so we were undertaking a larger collaborative research project specifically to characterize this moose mycoplasma in our wildlife, when we were surprised to identify Mycoplasma ovipneumoniae in apparently healthy caribou herds all across Alaska. And this was particularly remarkable because deer species like moose and caribou were not supposed to be even susceptible to Mycoplasma ovipneumoniae, and only animals in the sheep and goat families could be infected. And we also detected Mycoplasma ovipneumoniae in sheep, Dall sheep that were healthy, and that was contrary to the adverse health impacts that were seen in bighorn sheep. So this led us to refocus our project to look at MOV. And hunters were particularly generous in helping us collect samples during 2 seasons of horn sealing. And we also looked at archive samples of tissues and swabs from wildlife all across Alaska from over 3,700 hoofed animals collected since 2004. So in this highlights, I'm going to show you some results in a graphical format, but you can always go to the adf&g.alaska.gov website to look for the reports and details, and there'll be links to our publications as they come out. And on this map, I'm showing you the size of the circles represent the relative number of samples tested in a population, and we've centered that over the approximate range of that population. And the circles will go from the smallest, which are 10 samples or less for that population, and the biggest are 180 or more samples. So this map represents the MOV detections for our Dall sheep samples that were collected from 2004 to 2019. And this includes both molecular PCR detections of the bacteria, as well as serum antibody results showing animals had been exposed. And the detection level tiers are color coded so that red, orange, and yellow indicate how many different types of tests were run and how many different labs had detections. And purple means the results were inconclusive because we had inadequate sampling numbers for that population, and not necessarily that the organism wasn't present, but we didn't have enough samples to even try to detect it. So this shows us that there are more samples that we had available, and the more tests we ran, the higher our confidence that MOV was maintained in these populations. And since we had positive detections from our oldest archived samples from 2004, we documented that MOV wasn't new to these populations. And it also showed that the newer molecular tools that we employed in our research project could readily detect MOV and identify MOV compared to the older screening methods that we'd been using for a very long time. So since the sampling was just what was available to us and was not a random sample, it was discontinuous over a number of years, and we have unknown detection probabilities for the different tests that we're using, we can't calculate an actual prevalence rate in a population. But here we report the percentage of samples from a population that had a detection. And so the percent detection rate ranged from not detected in those populations where we had less than 20 samples to over 10%. And among the samples that came just from presumably healthy animals, those would be the live captured or the hunter harvested animals that were physically normal. The MOV detection rate was 0.7%. By testing almost 1,000 caribou, primarily live captured radio for collaring, we were able to confirm that MOV detections were in every one of the 8 herds where we had adequate samples, including detection in the earliest archived samples we had from 2004 from the Central Arctic herd. And the caribou samples had an overall detection rate higher than Dall sheep, about 9% versus 5% overall for Dall sheep, when all those samples we had over all years were combined. Then this map is showing us where the subset of caribou herd samples indicated by the asterisk and the Dall sheep populations indicated by the stars originated from were used to generate the strain typing results that I'm going to show you next. These subsamples were strain typed by a sequencing of 4 loci, which are small DNA segments on the whole genome of the organism, and it's a procedure called multi-loci sequence typing, or MLST. And this was done at the Washington State Diagnostic Lab. This analysis included samples from our earliest Dall sheep and caribou samples, as well as domestic sheep and goats, and an illegally imported exotic sheep that was residing in Alaska. So the MLST found that all the Dall sheep and caribou MOV samples that we had were consistent with a single strain in Alaska wildlife populations. And this was across all 15, the 15-year time span and geographically isolated populations. And that this Alaska strain was clearly different from any bighorn or domestic sheep or goat sample that was in the lower 48 or that we had from Alaska. And the domestic sheep and goat samples from Alaska carried at least 6 different strains in our sample. So this shows that a very different MOV was circulating in Alaska wildlife than has been found in domestic animals or bighorn sheep. And the difference here was further supported by doing full genome sequencing. So that's looking at the whole DNA. And in a study that includes all the Western North America wide thin-horn and bighorn sheep populations, it's a study entitled The Genome, Diversity, and Evolution of MOV in Domestic and Wild Sheep and Goats. And we participated in the study, and our samples, in looking at the preliminary results, they were able to confirm what we saw from the 4 loci examined in the MLST, that Alaska caribou MOV DNA strain is vastly different from any of the other domestic sheep and goats, as well as bighorn sheep strains. In fact, the genome is significantly shorter. So that means that it has fewer numbers of base pairs of DNA compared to any other MOV that has been analyzed. And this genome also lacks a particular gene that has been associated with causing disease in bighorn sheep. So in summary, all of our studies to date have been consistent, showing a enzootic mycoplasma bacteria residing in caribou and Dall sheep in Alaska that is different from the MOV in bighorn domestic sheep and goats. And enzootic here, I'm using this term to mean a pathogen that's always present in a population at some low level, but then can increase periodically. So the fact that we could detect the presence of this mycoplasma in only one apparently unique strain across the state of Alaska in discontinuous caribou and Dall sheep populations for at least a time span of 15 years supports the likelihood that it's been evolving here for a very long time, and it is enzootic. It's here to stay. It's very important to recognize that the presence of this unique enzootic Alaska strain, which is so different from those known from domestic pathogenic strains, that this Alaska strain might even be a different species of mycoplasma. But if you remember back when I mentioned in the studies in bighorn, there's no cross immunity from previous exposure to between MOV strains. So the mere presence of this Alaska MOV or the other moose mycoplasma I mentioned earlier does not suggest there's going to be any decrease in the vulnerability or risk of Alaska wildlife, our wild ungulates, from other MOV strains or other new respiratory pathogens, or even an outbreak of disease from this enzootic strain as additional stressors are piled on. You know, there may have in fact been outbreaks previously of respiratory disease and die-offs that went undetected from this organism, but currently it's at that enzootic level. There remains a lot for us to learn, and we can't prevent climate change stressors, so we must remain vigilant to prevent wildlife from exposure to environments contaminated by pathogens or parasites from domestic animals that our wildlife have no previous natural immunity to and no previous exposure, because this organism present could increase susceptibility to those other pathogens. And none of this work could have been done without a lot of help, especially from all the hunters who contributed samples, all our research collaborators and staff, and the federal aid funding that made it possible for us to perform our work. And I wanted to also mention, if you do observe a sick or dead sheep or have a concerning disease lesion in your harvested animal, please report it as quickly as you can to Fish and Game office and take pictures and bring in samples. And I put my email up there. So we're still investigating, disease in these animals and looking for other pathogens and monitoring the situation. So it's really helpful when we have the public out there, especially the hunters that are our eyes. Thank you.